All right, I'm going to start a little bit kind of backwards. Usually I like to go back into antiquity. I'm going to share something fairly recent with you, and that will be my initial point of departure in this very interesting class about Kugel, Shabbos Kugel. So there's a Fabrengen, Shabbos Parsha Shlach, 1970, and the Rebbes covers a number of very, very deep subjects here. And then he speaks about an issue, a burning issue in the Jewish world at the time. And he mentions that at a particular convention, rabbinical convention, this entire issue was ignored, swept under the carpet, not dealt with. The Rebbe was not happy about it. But the Rebbe had a sense of humor and everything. So he said, and there's no way, this is not edited, but they couldn't have made this up. I mean, the Rebbe must have said either this or something like this. The Rebbe said that one of the excuses is that the convention was on Erev Shabbos. So the Rebbe said they were busy probably making kugel for Shabbos. Making kugel for Shabbos. And the Rebbe said this. He said there is a saying from the Alter Rebbe that kugel, eating kugel on Shabbos, is biblical. It's min ha-Torah. The Rebbe said, I don't know where the source of that is. I don't know if the Alter Rebbe said it. However, that's what they said. So the Rebbe said, so therefore kugel is clearly very important. And maybe that's why they didn't get to dealing with this major issue, because they were preparing kugel for Shabbos. Now, the Rebbe didn't say that the Alter Rebbe said kugel is min ha-Torah, and obviously, if the Alter Rebbe did say that it was what we call a melitza, it's a euphemism, it's not literal. There are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. There's a mitzvah to sanctify the Shabbos when it arrives and ends. There is no mitzvah to eat kugel. In fact, one could argue that there isn't a mitzvah to eat on Shabbos biblically per se altogether. But here's the point. Clearly, kugel is an important thing. It's so important that it's purportedly said in the name of the Alter Rebbe that he used this kind of verbiage that it's min ha-Torah. Okay? So where does kugel come from? And how is it that virtually every Jewish community, certainly in Ashkenaz, has kugel on Shabbos? They don't share the same music. They don't share the same customs. They don't share the same clothes. Ashkenaz is a very big place. Jews in southern France and Jews in white Russia. They didn't have much in common, but they all had kugel. So obviously, it has to come from some common source. There has to be a time when we're living in the same place when we're eating kugel. Why do we end up eating kugel on Shabbos? What's so great about kugel? I mean, kugel essentially is either Lokshin Kugel or potato kugel, or challah kugel, or various other kinds of kugel. It's things which are made into kind of a paste, they're soft, and then held together with eggs and flour, and it gets fried. And that's what people eat on Shabbos. So the purpose of this class is to try to solve the mystery of the kugel. There's an interesting anecdote that's related. I think Reb Zalman Gerar related this. I believe he was there. That the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe, was sitting by the table, and they served kugel, and they served cholent, and the person was eating the cholent, which we'll talk about next week. First. So the Rebbe said, no. First you eat kugel, then you eat cholent. And he said, the kugel is round, you know. So the round kugel, it's like the ring on the chuppah. First comes the ring, and then the marriage is completed. First you eat kugel, and then you go on to eat cholent. Now, exactly what the Rebbe Rashab meant, I don't know. But again, it seems very clear that kugel is a big deal. It's a part of Jewish life. There's another story related about the Friedrich Rebbe. There's a cholent story also, but the Friedrich Rebbe sits down to the Shabbos table, and he has the Shabbos meal, and he asks his wife, there was no kugel? Did they make any kugel for Shabbos? So she says, oh yes, there was kugel. This is after he did Birchat HaMazon. And the story goes that he washed again, instructed everybody to wash over again, and he said, you have to eat kugel on Shabbos. Why do you have to eat kugel on Shabbos? What's the mitzvah to eat kugel? Who cares if it's kugel or not? But clearly there's a thing. And two more interesting details. In 1974, Lubavitch Youth Organization puts out a pamphlet to help people prepare for Shabbos, for Pesach, and Shabbos is Erev Pesach. So when Shabbos is Erev Pesach, it makes for extra challenges. And it makes for challenges because you have to have 2 challahs, and you can't use 2 matzah, because not only matzah Erev Pesach, but you have to have lechem mishnah. You have to have 2 loaves. So what do you do? It's a difficult thing. It's a good question. We'll have it in a couple of years. It's a whole story. The bottom line is you have to have challah, eat very carefully, and you have to flush the crumbs down the toilet. Make sure you finish eating it. So they wrote that you have to have challah made of chametz. You have to have challah on Erev Pesach, even though it's Erev Pesach. So the Rebbe used to edit these brochures. The brochure came to the Rebbe's desk, and the Rebbe wrote, Kugel, ? He said you have to have challah, Erev Pesach. It's a really hard menu to manage. The Rebbe said Kugel. I suppose he meant Lokshin Kugel, because Lokshin Kugel is not Pesach. Certainly in 1974, they didn't have this fancy Pesach Lokshin. Today you can read just about everything you find the chametz you can find for Pesach. But it wasn't like that in 1974. So what's up with the kugel? Like, who says the kugel is so special, and where does the kugel come from? Reb Meir of Primishlan, who was a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, he is purported to have said that Lokshin Kugel comes from Mount Sinai. That's what he said. So what does this all mean? All right. So I'm going to go back to antiquity. So I'm going to begin our mystery with a Gemara, which is found in Masechet Pesachim. And this Gemara will speak to us about how we prepare our Shabbat table. It's pretty well known that we make Kiddush on Friday night, and we also have 2 challahs, 2 loaves. Why do we have 2 loaves? The 2 loaves recall the double portion of manna that fell on Erev Shabbat. And then when you look in the Torah, the whole business of Shabbat being given to us is very closely linked to the manna that God gave us. There's much to be said about that, although that's not the subject for tonight. In a word, the notion of manna is the idea that God provided for us. People's official excuse for not keeping Shabbat is I have to make a living. So the manna says God provides for you. So if God provides for you, you do what Hashem says, He'll do what He said He'll do. So the manna becomes a paradigm for Shabbos. So there's a Gemara in Maseches Pesachim. It's on page 100, 100b, and the Gemara talks about what happens if you have a meal that goes on Friday night. It ends up extending. It's a family meal. People sit together. So what do you do by Kiddush? On Friday night, you're in the middle of the meal. So the Gemara uses the expression Poiros Mapo Mekadosh. The Gemara says you cover the challah and you make Kiddush. And the question gets asked, what's up with the covering of the challah? I understand when Shabbos comes you have to make Kiddush. Biblically, Kiddush, the remembrance of Shabbos, is something we verbalize. Rabbinically, it was instructed, or it was ordained that we should do that over a glass of wine. But why do you have to cover the challah? The Gemara says you have to cover the challah. So the Tosfos discusses this. And the Tosfos says, V'yesh mefarish, there is an opinion, there is one who explains, that this is zecher lemon, that the reason we cover the challah, which has a covering beneath and a covering on top, so the challah is kind of encased, is a remembrance of the manna. In other words, why would the manna have to be remembered by challah, which has a covering on the bottom and a covering on the top? The Tosfos says it didn't fall on Shabbat and on Yom Tov. There was a layer of dew on the bottom, a layer of dew on the top, and hamon ben atayim, and the manna was in between. Rashi in his commentary on Chumash says it was kemunach bekufsa, it was like put in a little box. It was sealed for freshness. So therefore, because it was sealed for freshness, and because manna becomes a poster child, if you will, for the concept of keeping Shabbat, that's why the challah, which is the sustenance, represents sustenance, and represents the basics of the meal, that's the foundation of the meal, that it has to be placed on the table with a covering on the top and a covering on the bottom. That's what Tosfos says. Tosfos is not alone in this. There are a number of other major commentaries who say the same thing. So I'll share a few of them with you. First of all, the Meiri. The Meiri was a great Rishon, and in his commentary on the Gemara in Maseches Pesachim, the Meiri says the following. Uprisas mapois, the spreading of napkins. Most of us know of challah boards today, and then we have cloth challah covers. But it doesn't seem it was always the case. The spreading of, he says, of a covering. A mappa could be a covering. So the spreading of coverings, plural. Shenoagu achshav, that we do today. Meiri says, Ein l'shorosh l'inyan halacha. This has nothing to do with a requirement, a halachic requirement, because the Gemara seems to refer to a halachic requirement. The Meiri says, in today's day and age, This is going back 800 years. 800 years later, 800 years ago, this was not a halachic requirement. Why was it done? Ella, the thing is, sheyesh remozimba, that it alludes to something. It has a message. Lamasha amru b'medrash, for this what's talked about in the medrash, shahaman, that when that food would come from heaven, shahaya yoyred, that it would fall, haya olav tal milmaila, v'tal lamata. There was a layer of dew on top and a layer of dew on the bottom. Ve'achar shenitchayvu belechem mishnah zeicher laman, since the requirement of having 2 loaves of bread on Shabbat is just as a remembrance of the manna, so therefore nagu, that's why the custom became, since the bread represents the manna, lahanicha, that we should place it bein shnei mapot, between 2 coverings. So the Meiri is very clear. He says, this is the reason we have this custom. Sephardim have the custom, Ashkenazim have the custom, Italian Jews have the custom. We don't know of a Jewish community that doesn't have the custom of covering the challah. The Meiri says it has nothing to do with halachic considerations. It's not everybody agrees. There are possible halachic considerations, but the Meiri tells us clearly that this has everything to do with the manna being zecher laman, a remembrance of the manna, and the manna had a covering on top and a covering on the bottom. There goes your challah coverings. Challah coverings are some of the most identifiable Jewish artifacts. Everybody knows what a challah cover is. If you grew up in a Jewish house, you know what a challah cover is. Then there's challah boards at some point. They figured if you have to have a covering at the bottom, you may as well make it hard so you can actually cut the bread on it. So then they're becoming, the industry of challah boards gets introduced. But we don't know if there was challah boards once upon a time, but we do know there was 2 coverings. In the Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, which is another great Rishon, where he talks about the mitzvah of, here it is, the mitzvah of this idea of covering the challah. So he says that this notion of covering the bread, this has to do with yifreis shtei mapais, he says, matter-of-factly. He says, spread 2 coverings, and that is zeicher lemidbar, a remembrance of our sojourns in the desert. Shahaman hayamunach tal tachtav v'tal olav, because the man was placed between 2 layers of dew, and therefore that has to be placed away. And he goes on to say, v'tzarich livtzoya al shtei kikre shleimus, you have to make a bracha over 2 whole loaves, and this is done zeicher l'lechem mishnah, as a remembrance to the double portion of manna that fell. So we have this idea, this imagery, if you will, on Shabbat, that things have to be encased or covered. The bread actually, in some way, represents the manna, but as you'll soon see in a moment, it doesn't really represent the manna. It represents the concept of nourishment and sustenance, and its double nature represents the manna. However, there is something else that's going to be added here into the mix. So, I'm just going to recap so nobody gets lost here. I started out sharing with you some interesting things from our Rebbe, from other Rebbes, right, about this idea of Kugel, clearly. And anyway, clearly Kugel has some kind of importance. And then we took what seems to be a tangent, a business of covering on Shabbos, covering the bread, covering on top, a covering on the bottom. Okay. We've talked about this a number of times, and I just want to briefly reiterate it because I think it makes the point that food and Shabbos go hand in hand. There's this concept of oneg. Shabbos has pleasure. What is pleasure? There are many forms of pleasure, but clearly this notion of Su'udat Shabbat is obligatory upon every single Jew. Su'udat Shabbat requires bread, it requires fish, it requires meat. This is what we call basics. Let me read to you from the Rambam, the 30th chapter in the Laws of Shabbos, the 7th halacha. The Rambam says, Eizehu oneg. So what's the pleasure of Shabbos? He says, Zehu sha'amru chachamim. This is what our sages said. Shetzarech l'taken tav shel shomin b'yoser. You have to have something really rich. If I translate it literally, really fatty. Umashke mevusam. And you have to have some fine drink. Fine drink. Mevusam literally means spiced or aromatic for Shabbat. Hakol lefim mamonok, or everything according to what you're able to afford. He doesn't talk about what that means, this tafshel shaman b'yoser. Doesn't talk about this very fatty thing. Doesn't say what it is. But he says there should be something rich, something very rich that adorns the Shabbos table. The Rambam says that if you spend a lot of money on Shabbat and you make many extra kinds of foods, harei ze meshubach. That's a beautiful thing. Of course, if somebody is a charity case, you don't make others pay for your Shabbat and so on and so forth. Okay. So here's the interesting notion. The notion is that bread we eat every day. Bread is bread. Fish, okay? Fish has a whole thing we learned about fish. And meat is meat. That's what people who live well or eat well, that's what they eat. You know, if somebody doesn't like fish or doesn't like meat, you don't have to eat fish or meat. But it has to be a Shabbat food. Some kind of Shabbat food which is prepared. So let me take you to the end of the Torah, to the book of Deuteronomy, and I'll share with you a very interesting Rashi. What I'm going to share with you now is not found in any of the other commentaries, with the exception of Rashi. It talks about the tribe whose job was commerce. They used to live in Tel Aviv. I mean, there was no Tel Aviv yet. There was just a sandy dune. They lived in Yafo. But this was their territory. They lived on the water. And once upon a time, living on the water wasn't so popular. People weren't impressed with the seashore. They wanted rich, fertile soil. Naphtali had this beautiful soil that was on the great heights of these high volcanic mountains where amazing things grew. And poor Zevulun is living in the seashore. He wasn't so happy. So Zevulun wasn't doing any farming. His land didn't produce much. He was involved in commerce. And this is where the harbor was. This is where the ships came in, and the ships came out. Caesarea had not yet been built. It's a later iteration that comes along in Herodian times where he tries to mimic Rome. But the real port, the main harbor city, is Yafo, an ancient harbor city that goes back maybe as long as 5,000 years. The Jewish people settled there, and this is the territory of Zevulun. So in his last words to the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu prophetically foresees the future of each tribe. And in the midst of talking about Zevulun and Zevulun's commerce, a very curious verse shows up. Chapter 33 of Deuteronomy, last chapter, verse 19. He says, Amim har yikru sham. Har yikru. The nations will call it a mountain. Sham yizbechu zivchei tzedek. There they bring these korbanot of righteousness. Ki shefa yamim yunaku v'shfunit munechel. Because there's an enormous abundance that comes from the sea. What does this mean? What does this mean that the nations are going to call the mountain? Which mountain? Which nations? So Rashi says the following. He says, because Zvulun was engaged in commerce, and business meant traveling, they would export and import, and because of this, people would come and visit them, different nations. Nations would come to Yafo to do business. And they would pick up whatever materials were, but before they set sail, they would say, Hoyol v'nitzta'arnu ad kan, since we had the tribulations of a journey to get all the way here, Neilach ad Yerushalayim, let's go to the capital city. Who knows when we'll be here again? It's a big deal in those days. Get on a boat and travel. So we're here already. We're in Israel. It's a couple of hours journey. Let's go to Jerusalem. V'nira ma yirasa. Let's see what's the religion, what's the faith of these people all about. So if they wanted to see what the faith of the Jewish people is, you have to go to Jerusalem. Let's see ma maseh. Let's see what their actions are like. Now, what does this mean? What their actions are like? Ma maseh. So it has to mean that how does this nation come together? And what kind of religious spirit unites this nation? And they felt they had to go to Jerusalem. Okay, so they would head off. They see all the Jewish people, 12 provinces. One could argue 13 tribes because there's 12 tribes, and then there's really Levi, and then there was converts, so people didn't have a tribe, 13, even 14 different classes of people, and all worshiping the same God. And Rashi says, they're all eating the same food. And they say, wow, this is amazing. Where we come from, everybody worships a different God. We have a pantheon of gods. When nobody's eating the same food. And they're very impressed with this. They say, you'll never find a more suitable nation. The unity here is fantastic. And people actually were so moved that there were people who converted to Judaism because they saw this. What is this talking about? You want to tell me they came to the Beit HaMikdash, they were impressed with the kind of display of faith and reverence for God? Okay. Not a pantheon of gods, but monotheism. Rashi, quoting our sages, the one thing that impressed them as much as the faith was our diet, our cuisine. And they said, they're all eating the same food. I think we should join this nation. Which food is that? Chinese. It doesn't say it was Chinese food, and then they would become, I don't know, the religion of Confucius.
They don't have the bread.
Bread? Well, we all eat the same bread. Bread is bread. What food is this? What food did they see that say, wow, they all eat the same food? It's got to be kugel. Well, why does there have to be kugel? So first of all, there's a sefer called Shulchan Ator, which is written by a Chassidic Rebbe from Yerushalayim, a Hungarian Rebbe called Aaron Rotta, told us Aaron Chassidim. He founded like Meir Sharem. Anyway, he wrote a book, but many of the things in his book he claims come from things that he heard from previous generations. He maintains that he has a tradition that this idea, this Rashi, is talking about Shabbat food. Special food that was made for Shabbat. So the question, of course, is what is the special food that's made for Shabbat? Bread is bread. You have bread all the time. Bread in this shape, bread in that shape. Bread is bread. Fish is fish, meat is meat. What is this food that they ate on Shabbat? So a hint for what this food that they ate on Shabbat shows up in the 13th century. In the 13th century, the forerunner of what we call today the modern-day Shulchan Aruch is a collection of customs and insights that were written by Rabbi Yaakov Segel Halevi, Rabbi Yaakov Moelen, who was a great German sage, and he began to hammer together the first codification, first real codification of Jewish law, especially as it governs daily life. So in the Sefer HaMaharil, in the Laws of Shabbos, it says, Mahari Segel said, Taimla the oichlin mulaya belel Shabbos. The reason we eat mulaya, the word mulaya comes from the word malay, which means filled, full, something that's full, something stuffed. The reason we eat mulaya belel Shabbos is a zecher lemon. It's a remembrance of the manna. Why is it a remembrance of the manna? Because you already heard that remembering the manna requires the remembrance of dew on the top and dew on the bottom. He says, munach talamaila or talamata. We know that it was placed with dew on the top and dew on the bottom. Hachinamar, so too, basar munach ben shnei dape isa. We have meat which is surrounded by some kind of dough. Essentially, he describes a meat knish here. This is the earliest description of a meat knish. Okay, you have a piece of meat and you have dough around it. And Mahari Segel is not telling you what to do. He's saying, here's why we do it. Everybody seems to be eating meat knishes on Shabbos. Why are they eating meat knishes? And he says the meat knishes is a remembrance of the manna. So now I want to tell you that this meat knish that he talks about is actually documented almost 2,000 years ago. Okay, and this is a different Gemara. This is a Gemara also found in Maseches Pesachim. The Gemara talks to us in the 7th chapter on page 74b. The Gemara talks to us about the prohibition of consuming blood. You know, we're not allowed to consume blood. So how do you get the blood out of the meat? Meat's full of blood. The answer is use salt. And the nature of salt is that salt draws out the blood. So we have this very intricate way, very sophisticated way of covering it with salt, allowing it to come out in 18 minutes. And people had special boards. Everybody you look young enough to remember this, right? Salting chicken. Huh? People went to the market, brought a chicken to the marketplace, came home with a dead chicken. You had to cut it up, and you had to salt the chicken, and then all the blood came out. And after the blood came out, that's how you had kosher chicken. You bang off the salt, you rinse it off, and then you have kosher chicken and kosher meat. That's what we've been doing ever since when. There is another way to get the blood off. There's another way. And this happens through roasting. Because the nature of roasting is that the heat draws out. So there is actually one part of the animal we eat which no amount of salt will help you for. And that is?
Liver.
The liver. How do you make liver? You have to actually broil. You have to broil, because liver is basically blood. You have to broil the liver until all of the blood comes out, and then you're left, instead of with red meat, you're left with brown liver. It means all the blood is gone. So actually, when they sell in the stores over here kosher liver, you have to brew a broiling job on it. If you don't do a broiling job, if you cook the liver like that, you actually eat not kosher food. So the Gemara has a discussion. If the meat was some way caked with flour or wrapped in dough, and then it was roasted, would the blood get trapped in the flour or the dough? Or would we say that once you roast it, the heat takes out the blood, and that the meat would be kosher and the dough would be kosher? This is the question that the Gemara deals with. So the Gemara seems to say that it would work out to even surround it with flour, because the blood would go straight through the flour and it would keep making its way out. It wouldn't stay in the flour. And therefore you could have like a knish. The Gemara describes an actual knish and says you put the meat, and you surround it with this phyllo dough, and you roast it, you broil it, and it's a broiled knish. So the dough cooks at the same time, and the meat comes and the blood comes right out. So the Gemara is describing this, and the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says that there was an elder whose name was Ravin. And Ravin, who was a Saba, he prepared taflahi bar guzola lerav. He breaded a certain kind of dove, certain kind of bird. He breaded it for Rav, and then va'amarle, and Rav told him, imayle tafle havli ve'echol. If the bread is good, tastes good, doesn't taste like blood, so he says, then I'll eat it. Because then we know that the blood went straight through, drained off, and what's left behind is a nice, hot, fresh knish, a dove knish. Okay. So Rashi says like this. Tafle, what is tafle? Tafle, he says, is a breading or a covering. So he says the tafle, this breading, is David. This is like a pie dough or a phyllo dough. So he says this is wrapped shekoiden. This is what's called pashtida. Pashtida. Pashtida is an ancient word used to describe the kugel-like food that was made by the Jewish people on Shabbos. I'm saying knish because it sounds like it. We'll soon see how knish became kugel. But pashtida, Rashi says, is this breaded kind of, it's a knish because it's breaded. It's got like dough or breading on it, and inside there's meat. So this is what's called, Rashi says, pashtida. You following so far? So we have the business of the bread with two coverings. And the two coverings reminds us of the manna. From the two coverings reminding us of the manna, we have this some kind of food people were eating on Shabbat. All the Jewish people were eating the same food. We don't know what this is yet. It can't be fish because fish is fish and meat is meat and challah is challah. So we don't know what there's some kind of food that everybody's eating the same food. So we have Mari Segel telling us that there's a custom of eating mulaya. What is mulaya? Sounds like a knish. That's what it sounds like. Where does this description of something which meat surrounded by dough, where does it originate from? Well, we have it back in the Gemara. Okay, have this the Gemara, and Rashi uses the word pashtida. Now, in the 16th century, when we have the Shulchan Aruch written, so we have in Siman Shin Yud Ches, in chapter 318, we have a long discussion of things which can be reheated or cannot be reheated for Shabbat. The rule is you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. What if something's fully cooked? Well, if it's cooked, it's cooked. But there's a proviso. The proviso is that there's no moisture. Because moisture gets cold, and then you cook it, it cooks all over again. But if it's dry, you can't bake bread twice. Baked bread is baked bread. So that wouldn't be called violating the Shabbat. If you take bread that's baked and you put it on top of the covered fire, the blech on Shabbos, it doesn't bake the bread again because it's already baked. So the question then became, what about this food which is called in Shulchan Aruch apandra? And the apandra, once again, sounds like a knish. Okay, you're talking about dough, and you're talking about meat inside it, meat or chicken inside it. So there's this whole big discussion. Is it considered dry because it's dry, or when it starts to heat up, all of a sudden the dried fat becomes liquid again? So the Alter Rebbe has a whole discussion about this. He says, kodim apandra. Alter Rebbe actually says you can't do it on Shabbos. The Mishnah Berurah doesn't agree. He says you could do it on Shabbos. But this is what's important that I want to share with you from the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, in the Shulchan Aruch it says, mutar litein sorry, I said apandra. In pandra. Keneged eish. You're allowed to take it in pandra keneged eish and do that on Shabbos. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. And then the Ramah brings down an opinion. You could do it, you can't do it, the various issues that come around. So the Mishnah Berurah says, apandra, hu pashtida. Apandra is pashtida. Now pashtida is the Gemara language for kugel, just by the way. Something which is kugel-like. What is it? In the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe calls it pas kfula. Pas kfula means double bread. Or, I'll go back to the verbiage of knish. It's bread that surrounds something. Something is breaded or surrounded. Pie dough. But he says, pas kfula, this is a doubled dough. Hamemula bechatiches shuman, which is filled with fatty pieces. V'noisnam sham kedei lechamamai. It's placed in this dough in order to heat it up. All right. So, it seems pretty clear that in antiquity, people were making a special dish on Shabbos, which was wrapped up. There was a breading or a dough on the outside, and there was a meat or chicken or something fatty on the inside. And this is what people ate on Shabbos. There seems to be some food. There was some Shabbos food that was eaten. Something which was unique or different. Something which wasn't run-of-the-mill. It was unique for Shabbos. So it seems that the unique food that developed for Shabbos had a cover on the outside and something else on the inside. Now, I cannot tell you exactly how and when, but our records indicate that in the 12th century, it was already very popular in Germany to take challah, last week's challah, and soften it with eggs and all kinds of other things, and then to wrap it in a way that it would bake, the outside would bake and be hard, and the inside remain soft. In other words, like this. The earliest kugel, kugel starts showing up in the 12th century in Germany. And the kugel that shows up, it seems initially was put on top of the cholent. They put kugel with the cholent. So they had, on Shabbos morning, when they take out the cholent, there would be something that cooked, it hardened on the outside, and it was soft on the inside. And apparently the crust, the hard crust on the outside, took the place of the mulaisa, of the dough, which was wrapped around the meat. Remember that many, many Jews living in Europe could not afford meat on Shabbat. They were lucky if they got a little meat on Yom Tov. And if they had meat, they did not necessarily have enough meat to be able to wrap it around. So the Sephardic Jews have a very popular food they eat on Shabbat called kibbeh. And kibbeh is phyllo dough wrapped around meat. It's like, what they call Moroccan cigars. Or this is very, very common. But in the Ashkenazi world, most Ashkenazi Jews could not afford meat. So people figured out that you didn't have to actually wrap meat in dough in order to make pashtida, or to have in pandra, but instead you could take whatever substance it was, and you could bake it or fry it on the outside, so you get a crust on the outside and something different on the inside. And it seems that is the origin of kugel. This is where kugel came from. Now, what seems to us is that in antiquity, people would have a special food that they made to look like the manna. And the special food to look like the manna would have to have a covering on the outside and something else on the inside. The Rambam talks about something shamein b'yoseh, something extremely fatty. It makes sense that he's talking about meat or chicken would be very fatty. A big pile of meat, or ground meat or other meat, wrapped around, that would be a very fatty food that was made uniquely and especially for Shabbos. Now the problem, of course, with the theory of the cholent kugel, which was called like kugel top or something, is that the Mahari Segal, living in Germany in the 13th and 14th century, he says that you would eat it on Friday night, not on Shabbos morning. So it wasn't in the cholent initially. Initially, this was eaten Friday night. And this leads us to kind of a conclusion as follows. From the ancient times, we had a special food that was crusted on the outside and soft on the inside, and this reminded us of the manna. Now, when we talk about the manna, it says that the Jewish people called it mun. This is Exodus 16, verse 31. They called it mun. Why do they call it mun? Because they don't know what to call it. They don't know what the stuff was. And then the Torah says like this: V'hu kezera gad lavan. It was like a white coriander seed. V'tamai, and its taste, Kitzapichas bedvash, like a pastry drizzled with honey. So Rashi says, okay, was this coriander or pastry? So Rashi says like this. He says, Zarei shaloi ogel, the coriander seeds are round. Ve'eni lovan, they're not white. But the mun was white. So then why do we use the terminology of zera gad? Rashi says, Ve'eni nimshal zera gad, it was only metaphorized as gad, le'inyan ha'igul, for its roundness. So the manna was round. Now we know the shape. In other words, the Torah communicated to us the shape of the manna. For whatever reason, it was important for us to know the shape of the manna. Not only what the manna looked like, or its color, not only what it tasted like, miraculously anything, or its basic taste of fine pastry, but that the manna was round. Anybody know what kugel means? So kugel in High German means circle, around. However, what's really interesting is that the word kugel stands for the word ki'igul. In the Mukha Arachayim it says that the word kugel is actually Hebrew, like many Yiddish words. And like many Yiddish words, it has nothing to do with German. It's pure Hebrew. Ki'igul. Igul is round. And interestingly, we have round challah only on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. I mean, Erev Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Only in Tishrei we have round challah. We make a point of not having round challah. We make a point of having braided challah. And that's a discussion in and of itself. That reminds us of the lechem hapanim, the breads which were brought, the show breads in the Beit HaMikdash, which were not round, but rather oblong. So we want that oblong shape, and we want the braids because it represents the many different breads.
Tell my wife not to make round challah. Just last Shabbat, she made a round.
No, round challah is only for the high holidays. Okay. We make a point of having long challah. So the long square challah, the long challah, made of many braids, brings to mind the lechem hapanim, the showbread, which was eaten once a week by the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash. That's when the changing of the bread, the changing of the guard of Kohanim came along with changing of the bread. But the Torah makes a point of telling us that the manna was round. So now we have to find some kind of round food. If the manna was trapped in covering on the top and covering on the bottom, then the most natural thing in the world is that if we're making food which has a crust on the outside or dough on the outside, that what shape should that food be? It should be round. Hence, the introduction of your kugel. Original kugels were round. The square kugel is a later invention. Original kugels were all round. And the word kugel means a circle. So it turns out that the concept of kugel actually is directly linked to the manna. This was the extra special food that was eaten in honor of Shabbat Kodesh, a non-basic staple, a non-necessary staple. It's not a regular part of the meal. It's not the bread, it's not the fish, it's not the meat. It's the kugel. It's that which comes along or accompanies the concept of the Shabbos meal. Here's an interesting thing which comes from the Rebbe of Kazmir. So he was a very holy man. He once said like this. He once said that when a Yid serves Hashem with davening, the Malachim can give him a run for his money. Because the Malachim, the angels, they daven much better than us. But when a Yid serves Hashem on Shabbat, by eating Shabbat food, the Malachim, they have not in the running. Because they never tasted kugel, he said. He said when a Yid eats kugel as an act of homage to Hashem, as an act of dedication, in other words, the Shabbos meal recalls the miracle of Shabbos. The whole of Shabbos, the whole notion of Shabbat Kodesh came about with God giving us food for 6 days, but not giving us food on the seventh. We had to collect it on Erev Shabbat, and that became the basic staple. That's how Shabbat is introduced to us. So there is a food which we eat at the Shabbat table, which is specifically ordained to remind us of the manna. And her name is Kugel. And now I'll share something else really interesting with you. The Jikov Rebbe, the mayor of Jikov, which is a Galician, a southern Polish Rebbe, when he was a little boy of 6 years old, he asked his grandfather, the famous Rav Naftali of Ropshitz. He asked the Ropshitz Rebbe, he says, tell me, Zayda, is there a hint in the Torah for Kugel? So without batting an eyelash, the Ropshitz Rebbe tells his 6-year-old grandson, a future holy man, he tells him, of course, when the Torah describes the shape of the manna, it says, Kizera Gad Lavan, Kugel. which actually makes perfect sense. Because the Chaf Gimel Lamed Kugel actually is the shape of the manna. And the Torah specifically makes a point of telling us the shape of the manna. Who cares? Because the Torah wants the manna to be real to us. It describes it, its contours, it describes its color, it describes its taste. So we know the shape of the kugel. He says, yeah, it makes sense. The words kezerah God love on, the words that describe the round nature of the manna, actually spell kugel. Yes?
So you have a covering on the challah, and you have a covering.
The challah itself doesn't represent the manna, though. It doesn't look like the manna.
So, but that was the reason they said they were.
The concept of the challah being covered, because the sustenance, challah represents sustenance. The sustenance came to us covered, so we have our challah covered. Yes, we have copious sources for that. But then there's this idea of the Shabbos food or Shabbos meal having a double covering. So here we have a food which in and of itself has a double cover. And as many pointed out, that the really, really fancy chefs, the really kugel makers, they'll put interesting stuff in the kugel. They put raisins in the kugel. They flavor the kugel. What's on the outside or what's on the inside, you get surprises when you break out the crust of the kugel. So the kugel always has a crust, and like many people, they turn the kugel over, they fry it on one side, fry it on the other side. There's this whole business of the outside of one kind of kugel, and then inside, it's a different kind of kugel. It's a different kind of food, which is also the notion of that which is reminiscent of the man. In the Sefer Zmiris Tiferes, he says, what do we do on Shabbat as a hidur, as going the extra mile to show Hashem that we want to observe the Shabbat with holiness? How do we go the extra mile? He says, kugel. That's how. That's the extra mile. And he says, in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, we used to bring our firstling fruits to the Beit HaMikdash. And he says, you had to bring the firstling fruits. You didn't have to decorate it. But the Jewish people traditionally would decorate the baskets. He says, the kugel, that's the decoration of the baskets. And I'll finish off with something really fascinating. So there's this tradition amongst different Polish Sfarim that says that the Lokshin Kugel, Lokshin is Yiddish for noodles, broad noodles, kind of Jewish noodles. So the Lokshin Kugel, they said, this is a segula that one should have an easier time to make a living when you make Lokshin Kugel for Shabbos. And those people made a big deal about Lokshin Kugel. And they said, why? Because the Gemara in Masechet Pesachim on page 118 tells us, Koshin mizanoisav shal adam kekriyas yamsov. It's so hard to make a living, it's like splitting the sea. Lokshin stands for Loi kashan, nit shver. Loi is no, and kashan is hard. So Lokshin means not hard. So therefore the Lokshin Kugel, which represents the manna, it's a basic staple, which is why they used Lokshin, because the manna was a basic staple. So this is common carbohydrates, held together with flour and eggs, and then fried. And it's got, Rambam said, Shamim b'yoser, the kugel is very fatty. Everybody knows that kugel is fatty, that's the nature of kugel. But this has this business of that making kugel, eating kugel as an act of homage to Hashem, makes it easier for parnasa. So lest you think this is like this kind of ridiculous supposition, Lokshin Kugel, late Koshin, listen to this. The pasuk in the Torah that talks about this is what we should do. We should gather manna on Erev Shabbat in order to be able to eat on Shabbat, double portion. So in verse 16 of chapter 16, the Torah says like this, Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jewish people, Shabbat's coming. This is what God said. Liktum imenu ish lefi achlei. Everybody should collect the collection of the manna. Mispel nafshasechem, for each and every one of you, and that should be ish la'asher b'ahol tekachu. You collect the manna, you take home the manna. The Baal HaTurim says there's something fascinating about this verse. It's one of only two verses in the Torah that has every single letter in the Aleph Beis represented. So remember the ancient days when they had typewriters, and you wanted to test the typewriter? They used to type a sentence, the lazy fox. Somebody want to finish a sentence for me? You know, jumps over the fence. You know what I'm talking about? There's a sentence that has every letter in the alphabet. So you remember in the old days with typewriter, you didn't know if one of the letters was faulty. So the way you would test the typewriter is you type the lazy fox, whatever, and then if everything comes out okay, you get every letter in the alphabet. You ever knew that? And I'm already like in the end of typewriters. Like I still remember the typewriters. But
I had one all my life.
Yeah.
all right, so that's the trick, okay? In case your computer ever breaks, you'll check out the lazy fox. So there's only two psukim in the Torah that have every letter in the Aleph Beis represented. And the Baal HaTurim, quoting the Mechilta, says like this. If you fulfill the Torah, The whole Torah, all the Aleph Beis, he says. The whole Aleph means all the Torah. If all the Torah, so then you'll be able to make an easy living. And there is a link between the time of Jeremiah, where the people complained they couldn't keep Shabbat, and they couldn't make a living. And Jeremiah purportedly took out the manna, because there was a jug of manna that had been placed away, and he said, you see, this is the manna. Your ancestors were sustained by God. God made his promise to you. He'll sustain you as well. You keep his Torah, he'll make sure you make a living. It doesn't mean you sit on your behind and wait for money to rain from heaven. It means you work 6 days a week, but 6 days a week, not on Shabbat. In other words, the manna represents the idea of God's sustenance. So it's not such a far stretch then. I mean, these were tzaddikim. They didn't play games, these people. It's not such a far stretch to say. Somebody said that the Lokshin Kugel loy kashan, it makes you having a living easier. The eating of the kugel, which reminds us of the manna, it's supposed to remind us of the manna. It's this common Jewish food that we all ended up eating with this crust with something inside. So the food which reminds us of the manna, making kugel, eating kugel as an act of devotion and love and loyalty to Hashem, ultimately is our key to being able to make an easy living.
That's what I've been doing wrong.
Try it. You haven't been eating Lokshin Kugel. The bottom line is this. I wanted to tell you one more thing. That in the Tur, which is the original structure of the Shulchan Aruch, it says, Kol hama'anig es haShabbos, anybody who delights in the Shabbat, nostin lo nachla b'li mitzarim, he gets an unbridled inheritance. So the Darkei Moshe, which is the commentary on the Tur, written by the Ramah, who wrote the second half of the Shulchan Aruch, he says, Maharil said that you have to eat mulaisa, you have to eat this filler, the forerunner of Kugel, Zeichel Shahaya Munach Talamayla V'Talamata. In other words, on the words of the Torah that says that you have to be me'aneg es haShabbos, you have to delight in the Shabbat, the Darkei Moshe says, don't forget to eat your Kugel. And now it makes sense when the Rebbe wrote in that pamphlet, Kugel, because the Kugel is a big deal. And what this really shows us is that nothing in Yiddishkeit is by happenstance. Every little detail about our Judaism is layered with deep origins. It has a holy message for us. And when we hold fast to our traditions and we behave in a way that Hashem wants us to, trying our best to honor Hashem and to honor His Torah, so then this becomes a vehicle for bracha and hatzlacha for each and every one of us. Enjoy your kugel, and may Hashem grant everybody ample parnasa. We should be able to keep Shabbos in a state of menucha. And you know, when we keep Shabbos right, then we get to really have our kugel and eat it too. Because when you keep Shabbos, this accelerates the process of the cosmic Shabbos, the coming of Mashiach. B'mheira will be Ameinu. Amen.